Hello friends, welcome to JavaEE EJB JPA tutorial. So now we are starting the new subseries JPA entity and CRUD operation. CRUD stands for create, read, select, view, update and delete. So in the previous video we just created a savings account and we have the create module in JSP. So in this video we will go with a controller layer. That means we will create a servlet that will act as a controller. Then it will propagate the HTML form information to the bean, and bean will make use of entity. It will return back to the controller, that means the servlet. Then servlet will respond back using the JSP. So when we follow this layered approach, we will also learn how to use create, select, update and delete operation using the JPA entity. So in this video we will learn about the entity state, because when we perform create, read, update and delete operation, we need to understand the entity states that plays a major role when performing all these four different operations. So here are the prerequisites. If you watched all the previous video, you may know by this time. You need to set up the Wildfly and Eclipse environment, because that's the IDE we use. We use Wildfly 10.1 as a middleware. IDE is Eclipse Neon. So here I'm mentioning Neon. Why? Because Neon and Wildfly 10.1 will sync well. So that's why you can use Eclipse Neon and Wildfly 10.1. If you use a different Eclipse version, then you should know what is the supported Wildfly version. When you pick Wildfly 10.1, you can do a web search of what are all the Eclipse J2EE IDE, JavaEE IDE that will sync with a specific version. So instead of doing those research, you can install Wildfly 10.1 runtime and Eclipse Neon, so your learning goes smooth. And after setting up Wildfly and Eclipse, that means here you have to go for a servlet tutorial, playlist 06. There we specified how to set up this environment. Similarly, we have to create 4 projects and a JPA project that was explained in the previous subset. So here we doesn't added that here as part of the prerequisite, but you have to go with the previous subset also. There we created a JPA project, and here in this video we created 4 projects. One is the EAR project, then EAR state, bean project and bean client, after that web project. So that's explained here in this video. Then in the previous subseries we created a JPA project also, so you can watch that previous subseries, and in this subseries we will continue with this same JPA project. Alright, next, to continue with the JPA entity, you have to set up the SQL server. That's also a part of a prerequisite. The tutorial is a JSP tutorial, and this one is optional, and this one is mandatory. So here you will set up the Eclipse environment, and here Eclipse and SQL server. Here you will set up Wildfly with SQL server. After that you need exposure to Eclipse, servlet tutorial, as well as JSP. If you want to learn, you can go through this playlist, or if you have a basic knowledge, you can directly watch this video. So here we use a minimal requirement of JPA as well as servlet. We won't go in advanced concepts. Here our goal is to learn EJB and JPA, so we will take only the basics of servlet and ASP when we create the examples. So previously we created entity for saving account, right? So we know that entity will map to a database record. Here entity can be in 4 states. These states are new, then managed, then marked for delete, or we can call it as removed. After that we have an entity called detached. So all these state we will learn here in this video. So as already told, entity will represent a particular record in a table in the database. So, and entity is a Java class, and you can create an instance out of it. So for example, you can use the new keyword to create a new JPA entity. So after you created that, the entity will go into heap. So after creation, the state of the entity will be new. So in this new state, the entity is not attached to the database. Remember, so an entity created in the, so let's say this is the Java instance, this will be mapped to a database record, right? That's what we saw in the previous video when we created a new entity. So that means there is a linkage between these two, and here field represents a column, right? So when we created a new entity, that time the entity is not managed in the sense the JPA entity manager doesn't know that the particular class instance is representing a specific database table. So that's why here the new state comes into picture. So new means object is created and it is living in the heap, and it is not yet attached to any of the database record. Of course it's new, right? Using the new keyword we are creating it, so it's not attached to any of the database record. So on entity manager, when you make a call to persist method, so for the persist method you will pass the entity and you will call this persist on the entity manager. Previously we saw this, we created a new saving account using this same method. So we created a new entity instance, then we called for entity manager.persist. So what happens once you persist this, the data will get stored here in the database. Also the state of the entity, let's say this is the entity, we will call this as E1. Here E1 is created, E1 is persisted, then E1 goes to managed state. Managed state in the sense there is a link between your entity and your database. So after the persist, I can say that this particular record is representing a particular, this particular instance, entity instance or entity object is representing a specific row in the database table XYZ. So you can read data from the database using the entity manager's persist method, or you can use a query, JPA query, and you can read the content from the database. So once you read the content, let's say the find is uniquely identifying a record, and it will return that record and creates a entity instance, and the entity instance will be in the managed state. That means here we queried it from the database and the link exists. Here it's not new, the record was already there in the database and you retrieved it using the find or query method. When you retrieve this record from the, or when you retrieve the row from a table, once it comes to Java side, it will be represented as a entity instance, and each member represents a column. So in this case, after this find a query, we will get an entity instance, and we can say that entity instance is in the managed state. So in the managed state, there will be a link between database and the database record. So these state changes are useful when we learn the create, read, update, delete. Watch it carefully. At this moment, it may be vague. Once you complete the example, you will come to know all these concepts when you watch this video once again. But for now, you can say when a new instance is created, that's the state here. Using the Java new keyword, you will create an instance, then you will populate field, all those stuff. And before the persist, this will be in the detached state, or we can call it as a new state. New, or we can even say detached. In a new state, the record will not be here at all. But in detached state, record will be there, but the entity is not in the, there is no link between the record and the entity. Here, record itself will not be there. Once you persist, the state immediately changes to managed. So here, when you use find or query method, the state will be, initially will be in the managed state. So new, managed. Now we will go for mark for delete. So here, if you see, we can make a call to entity manager.remove. So that means the state will be in the removed state. So removed state in the sense the state change will be from managed to removed. So what we can do, once we have entity in hand, and if it is managed, that means linked to a specific record, we can issue entity manager.remove. That means entity will mark this record as removed. So there will be managed and removed state here, right? Now there is a detached state also. We will talk about this detached state. For now, let's just have it here, detached. So there will be a transaction, and we will learn about this transaction soon. When the entity is in managed state, or when it is in removed state, when a transaction commits, here, if you see, it will either issue an insert command, or it will issue an update command. Now let's say we created a new instance, then we are making call to persist. So the entity will be in the managed state, and when transaction commits, the JPA will issue an insert command. JPA in the sense through entity manager. We can call entity manager. It knows the persistent context, right? It will issue an insert command in the SQL language. Or if we use a find method, then let's say we modified some field here, and after, when the transaction commits, see, after the retrieval, it is in the managed state, right? It's in the managed state. When the entity is in the managed state, some records got changed or some field got changed, and when transaction commits, it will, I mean, the entity manager will issue an update command. That means a SQL update. Here it will be a SQL insert statement will be fired to the underlying database. And when entity is removed, so we retrieved an entity through query or through find method. After that, we issued an remove command. When transaction commits, it will issue a delete SQL statement. So here you may be wondering, what is this transaction? Previously we used the new in the previous subseries, right? And we doesn't create any transaction object at all. So you may be wondering what is the transaction, how a transaction is committed, all those stuff. So we will talk about that soon. So what happens, okay, so we will talk about this later. Here if you see in the detached stuff, so once a transaction is committed, the entity will go to a detached state. That means this is the database record, and previously the entity was in a managed state. Now it is in detached state. So when it is in detached state, even though the entity fields can be mapped to a database field, if you make any modification here during the transaction commit, nothing will happen. So that means when the entity is in a managed state, the time only either it should be in the managed state or it should be in the removed state. Removed means from managed to removed, it got moved. So during these two time, when transaction commits, the corresponding SQL statements will be executed. When it is in detached state, nothing happens. So all this stuff you will understand once we complete the example. You have to come back here and you should hear these once again. Alright, now let's look at the operation sequence one by one. First we will learn about the create sequence. If you see, using the new keyword, we will create an instance. So the state of the instance is new. Here are the fields. Then in the next stage, what we will do, we will populate these fields. So a new entity instance will be created. So simply, if we look at our previous example, savings account is equal to new savings account, right? Then we will populate each of the field. That means person ID, name, then balance, and if there are some other field, we will populate it. So that's how we do the sequence of operation for creating a new record in the database using the JPA. First we will create new, then we will populate it. After that we will make use of entity manager, then we will make a call to persist method. So once you make a call to the persist method, the entity is transformed to a record in the database on a particular table, right? So here if you say the state changes from new to managed, here it's persist method, right? New to managed, and here a transaction will be committed. After the transaction is committed, once the method returns, the entity goes to detached state. So transaction commit, if you see, we have entity manager in a Java bean, right? Inside a method, let's say we are creating a new instance, then we persist. That's all we will do. We will make a call to em.persist. So at the end of this method, the transaction will be automatically committed. So who will watch for this transaction? The entity manager will watch for this transaction. Remember, we have this entity manager with the persistent context, and that we placed in our stateless session bean. Inside the stateless session bean, we will write a method, and we create a new instance of saving account. We will populate the content that is coming as a parameter. Of course, these parameters are taken from the HTML form, and it is coming here as an incoming parameter. After creating the new, we will make a call to em.persist. Of course, we will populate with this incoming parameter, then we will make a call to persist. So here, let's say here is the persist method call. So after this call is completed, it is not like the entity manager will immediately issue the insert statement, SQL insert statement. It's not like that. So it will wait. The transaction will be committed at the end of this function call. When it is returned to the caller during that time, before returning the call, entity manager will commit the transaction. Since it's a transaction commit, and in this entity manager, if there is here in this case, if you see new populate then persist, so it will perform an insert statement. When it will perform? During the method return, that means during the transaction end. So the state change, if you see new to managed to detached. So after this call ends, the entity will be in detached state. That means if you return the same entity object, here we are creating it with the new, right? Even if you return to the caller and if caller performs some update, nothing happens. Why? Because the entity gone into a detached state. So this is the sequence. Once again, we will create a new entity using the new keyword. Entity will be created in the heap. The state will be new state. Then we will populate the field still in the new state. We will make a call to persist. So during this persist, still in the new state, and once the call completes, persist complete, it will go into a managed state, new to managed state. After that, towards the end, the transaction will get committed by our entity manager. So it will issue an insert statement and record will get persisted, and the state moves from managed to detached state. So new state, managed state, after the persist, after transaction commits, detached state. Now let's look at the next sequence. So here is the read, or we can say it's a select also. So read, we can do it using the find method, or we can do it using the query. So in find method, it will return a single record. The find method works on a key field. Query, it can even return a multiple record. That means you may get an array of entities. So the entities will be in the managed state. So here there is no new also here. Once this is completed, we will get the entity in the managed state. Again, let's say we have a bean, and that bean has the entity manager defined or attached using the persistent context at the rate persistent context, and we will specify persistent unit, all those stuff, right? So that entity manager is here. So this entity manager will watch for each and every method. Once the method returns, it performs a commit. That means we can say it's a transaction commit. So the find method, so let's say here we have the find method. After that, it will return some entity, right? So this entity will be in the managed state, and it represents a particular record. So here, that's why if you perform some update, since it's in a managed state, that will get reflected here. But for now, for select, you can think of the entity will be in the managed state. So that's the sequence here. You can use query or find to represent a database record into an entity format. Or entity instance will be created here, and that entity instance will be in the managed state. The third one is the update. Let's look at the sequence. So here is our DB, and let's say we have a record. So this database record is retrieved using the find method, and we have a Java JPA entity, So we know that after the find method, because previously we learned about the read, right? This is nothing but a read operation. This will be in the managed state. Next, what we will do, we will perform some field modification, or we can say field update. We have getter and setters method, right, in the entity class. Saving account, if you take, we have getter and setter method. Let's say using the setter method, you updated the balance field, right? We found one record and we updated it using the set balance. That means a field is updated. So this will be the managed entity. Here also it's a managed entity, but a specific field is modified. Some field, let's say, that's modified here, and it is still in managed state. So towards the end, what happens, transaction will be committed by entity manager. So once the transaction commits, it will perform an DB update. And so remember, this transaction commit will happen when business method ends, right? Closing curly braces, when business method ends. So after this transaction commit or update, what happens, you can still hold the entity, but it is a detached. So this is the different you have to understand. So when it is in detached state, there will not be any update that will be issued back to the database. Here if you see, specific field is modified, and when an update statement is fired, it will go back and specific field, whatever field is updated, that get updated here. Let's say this will be our bean instance, stateless session bean, which is holding the entity manager. As we already told, the sequence of operation will be like this. One, you will find a record, then you will perform the field update. So this is where the information will feed from the HTML form and a servlet controller layer. That way it takes that route and it comes here. You will populate the field, or you will update the field using the setters method, and then finally towards the end, this entity manager will issue the update command. Look at here, we are not making call to persist or any other method here. We are just finding it, then we are updating the field, that's all. So towards the end, transaction commits, entity manager will watch, and it knows that the entity is in managed state, and while keeping the entity in managed state, some specific field is updated, and it knows that it needs to issue the update command, but it issues towards the end of the function. Before the method returns, it will perform the update. So this is the update sequence. So if you see here, the state changes are managed, detached, right? So once the transaction commit, after the transaction commits, the state change always moves to the detached state. Now let us look at the delete option. Now you may be well aware of it. Database, the same way, entity record will be queried using find or JPA query method. Will be in the managed state, or because it's a read at this stage. Then in the entity manager, this time we will make a call to remove method. Remember, for update we doesn't invoke any entity manager method, but for create we will make a call to persist, and for update we just make the field modification, but for delete here we will make a call to remove. So what happens, the specific entity here goes to the removed state or marked for delete state, and finally when a transaction commits, for simplicity reason we will just keep it as transaction T circle. When a transaction commits, so entity manager is sitting on top of it, and this is the reason why we will use entity manager on a stateless session bean. And when the business method, we can call these as a business methods. When the business method commits, it will issue a delete command. So after the delete, this record will be deleted here. So even if you have this record, it will be still in the detached state, and holding it will be not useful because the record itself removed. That's all. So these are all the CRUD operation: create, read, update, and delete sequences. So before we close, once again we will review. There is a entity manager that is attached to a bean. The bean will act as a business layer, and entity manager is hooked to it. Here we can have a lot of business method, let's say A, B, C, D, whatever you can call. That's for a business method A, let's say, and this is a business method B. So we are talking about transaction, right? So entity manager with a persistent context, it is defined. So we have a entity manager em. Then using this entity manager only, previously we called em.persist, right? So here if you see, using entity manager, you can make a call to find persist and remove. Now you know what are all the state change associated to this. So after the persist, the state will change to managed state. Find takes the record from the database and keeps the entity in managed state. Remove, entity will be in the managed state, moves to the marked for delete state, and the state change can occur anywhere here in the code, right? But actually SQL statements will be fired towards the end. Towards the end means you can always think that before returning this transaction, before returning this business method, entity manager will supply the SQL statement. So the SQL statement can be anything. It depends on the state change, and it will either fire, insert, update, or delete. Right? So let's say if method A is called by method B, so once method returns, if you see here, if something is in managed state, here it will go to detached state, same stuff. If you are returning the object, so let's say here entity is created here, then it is returned to B. The entity will be in the detached state. Why? Because here transaction is committed. Whatever SQL statement needs to be fired on the database, that will be fired, and the entity will be in the detached state. So the method A and B need not to be in the same bean. It can be on a different context also. Let's say there is a servlet which is making use of this entity bean. It's making call to A, then performs some action, then making call to B, and the return value it is using here, and it is supplying it to B. Till this point, the entity will be in the managed state. Since function is returning, let's say this is the servlet. Since the method is returning here, and after that if you make call to B, even though you pass the return value of the entity to method B, here the same entity will be in the detached state. It may be here in the managed state, but when it enters method B, it will be in detached state. Here comes the merge into action that we will, okay, forget it. We will talk about this in the next sub-series. So for now, you learned the sequence of operation: create, read, update, delete, and you also learned the JPA entities state: new, then marked for delete. We can say the state as a remove state. Then you learned detached state. Then you learned managed state. So when an entity is in a managed state, if you perform any field update, towards the end of the transaction, entity manager will automatically perform the update. Okay, that's all here in this video. There is no demo. This theory part may be slightly vague, and after completing the sub-series, you can easily recapture these concepts. So after completing the example, if you watch this video once again, and this video looks like a simple one, or it will be a refresher. That's all here. Thanks again for watching. Bye.